A transport ship landed on Earth with a sound like thunder. Zolfek looked out the small window at the strange blue sky. He had seen many worlds, but this one felt different. The air smelled odd when he stepped outside. It was too clean, too. Fresh. His home world always smelled of metal and burning fuel. Zolfek stood 7 feet tall. His skin was hard like armor, dark gray with patches of black. He had 4 arms instead of 2 like humans. His eyes were large and yellow, built for seeing in the dark. People stopped to stare at him as he walked. Some children pointed and whispered. He ignored them. He was a soldier of the Corvani Empire, and soldiers did not care about stairs. The human military base was smaller than he expected. Corvani bases were huge, dark places with walls that reached the sky. This place had green grass and old stone buildings. Trees grew everywhere. It looked more like a park than a place where warriors trained. A human approached him. The man was much shorter than Zolfek, with graying hair and sharp eyes. He wore a simple green uniform with patches on the shoulders. "You must be Zolfek," the human said. "I'm Commander Jake Morrison. I'll be your guide here." Zolfek straightened his back and brought all 4 arms to his sides. This was the proper way to greet a superior officer in the Corvani military. He waited for Morrison to do the same. Morrison did not. Instead, he held out one hand. "Nice to meet you," he said with a small smile. Zolfek stared at the hand. In Corvani culture, touching someone you just met was rude. But he was on a human world now. He reached out with one of his arms and shook Morrison's hand. The human's grip was firm, but not challenging. "Welcome to West Point," Morrison said. "I know this must all seem strange to you. It is different," Zolfek admitted. He had expected the humans to be more formal, more like proper soldiers. Morrison led him through the base. Young humans in gray uniforms walked in groups, talking and laughing. Some carried books. Others practiced marching in formation, but even they seemed relaxed. In the Corvani military, soldiers never laughed during training. They barely spoke unless ordered to. "These are our cadets," Morrison explained. "They're learning to be officers. Just like you did, I imagine." Zolfek nodded, but inside he was confused. Corvani training was harsh. Young soldiers learned through pain and fear. They slept little, ate less, and spoke only when spoken to. These human cadets looked healthy and well-fed. They seemed almost happy. Morrison showed him to his room. It was small but clean, with a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over the green spaces. There were books on the desk about human military history. "You'll start classes tomorrow," Morrison said. "Professor Carter will teach you about how humans fight wars. I think you'll find it interesting." After Morrison left, Zolfek sat on the bed and looked around the room. Everything was so different from what he knew. At home, soldiers slept in large rooms with hundreds of others. There was no privacy, no personal space. Here, he had his own room, his own bed, his own books. He picked up one of the books. The title read, "Great Battles of Human History." He opened it and saw pictures of human soldiers from different time periods. Some wore metal armor. Others had strange weapons he did not recognize. All of them looked determined, ready to fight. Zolfek had studied human military records before coming here. On paper, humans seemed weak. They were small, slow, and had no natural armor. They lived short lives and were often ruled by emotions instead of logic. Many species in the galaxy thought humans were nothing special, but the Corvani Empire was not so sure. Humans had been fighting wars for thousands of years. They had beaten enemies much stronger than themselves. They had survived disasters that would have destroyed other species. Something about them was different, And the Empire. Wanted to know what? That night, Zalthek lay in his bed and thought about home. His people valued strength above all else. The strongest led, the weak followed. Orders were given and obeyed without question. It was simple, clean, and effective. But here, things seemed more complicated. He had watched the cadets during dinner. They talked to their instructors like equals. They asked questions, made jokes, and even disagreed with each other. In the Corvani military, such behavior would result in punishment. Yet these humans were training to be officers. They would lead soldiers into battle, make life and death decisions, and represent their species among the stars. How could they be effective leaders if they were so casual? Zalthek closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow would bring answers to his questions. Tomorrow, he would begin to understand what made humans such unusual warriors. But sleep had not come easily. His mind kept turning over what he had seen. The green grass, the laughing cadets, the books on his desk. Everything was so different from what he had expected. He thought about Commander Morrison's handshake. It was such a small thing, but it bothered him. In Corvani culture, physical contact established dominance. The stronger person would grip harder, hold longer, make the other person submit. But Morrison's handshake had been different. It was not about dominance at all. It was about connection. Zalthek had never experienced anything like it. In his world, soldiers were tools to be used. Here they seemed to be treated as individuals, people with thoughts, feelings, and worth beyond their ability to fight. Alien Officer finally drifted off to sleep, but his dreams were troubled. He saw images of human soldiers doing impossible things, achieving victories that should have been defeats. He saw cadets who laughed and joked, but fought with the fury of true warriors. When he woke the next morning, Zalthek felt different. Something had changed inside him, though he could not say what. He dressed in his uniform and prepared for his first day of classes. He did not know it yet, but his transformation had already begun. Professor Lisa Carter stood at the front of the classroom, her hands behind her back. She was a small woman with short gray hair and scars on her arms. Zalthek had learned she was a former Marine, though she looked nothing like the warriors. He knew she was too small, too old, and she smiled too much. "Today we'll talk about the Battle of Thermopylae," she said. "Can anyone tell me what happened there?" A young cadet raised her hand. 300 Spartans held off thousands of Persian soldiers. "That's right, Amanda," Carter said. "But the interesting part isn't that they fought. It's how they fought." Zalthek leaned forward in his seat. He had heard of this battle. According to Corvani military analysis, it was a perfect example of human stupidity. The Spartans should have retreated when they saw how outnumbered they were. Instead, they stayed and died. It was wasteful and pointless. Carter pulled up a map. On the screen, the Spartans chose to fight at a narrow pass. They couldn't be surrounded. The Persians had to come at them a few at a time. "What does this tell us about human tactics?" Another cadet spoke up. "They used the terrain to their advantage." Exactly. They turned their weakness into strength. The Persians had more soldiers, but that didn't matter in the narrow pass. The Spartans made the enemy's numbers meaningless. Zalthek made notes with all 4 of his hands. This was not what he had expected to learn. In Corvani military theory, more soldiers always meant victory. Numbers were everything. But the humans seemed to think differently. Now, Carter continued, let's look at another example. The Battle of Rorke's Drift. 100 British soldiers against 4,000 Zulu warriors. She showed pictures of the battle. Zalthek saw human soldiers behind makeshift walls, fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. By all logic, they should have been crushed in minutes. The British won, Carter said. not because they were stronger or better armed. They won because they refused to give up. They fought for each other, for their homes, for their beliefs. That's what made them dangerous. A cadet named Ryan Tucker raised his hand. But why didn't they just retreat? They could have lived to fight another day. Carter smiled. Because sometimes retreat isn't an option. Sometimes you have to make a stand, even if it seems impossible. After class, Zolfek approached Carter. He was confused by what he had heard. "Professor, I do not understand. These battles you describe, they were defeats disguised as victories. The soldiers died." Carter looked at him with interest. "Did they? At Thermopylae, the Spartans died." "Yes, but their sacrifice inspired all of Greece to unite against the Persians. They lost the battle, but won the war. At Rorke's Drift, the British survived and held their position. They showed that humans don't break easily. But the cost," Zolfek said. "So many deaths. In Corvani military doctrine, we would call this poor planning." "Maybe," Carter said. "But tell me, Zolfek, what does your military doctrine say about impossible victories?" Zolfek thought about this. In truth, Corvani doctrine did not account for impossible victories. If a battle could not be won, it should not be fought. Resources should be preserved for better opportunities. It was logical, efficient, and practical. But as he walked back to his room, Zolfek found himself thinking about the human battles. The Spartans had not been stupid. They had been brave. They had chosen to fight for something bigger than themselves. The British at Rorke's Drift had done the same. The next day brought practical exercises. Zolfek was assigned to work with a group of human cadets. Their leader was Ryan Tucker, the same cadet who had asked about retreat in class. Tucker was young and confident, with the kind of attitude that would have gotten him beaten in Corvani. "Training. We're going to run a simulation," Tucker explained. "Hostage rescue. 20 civilians trapped in a building. Unknown number of enemies. We need to get everyone out alive." Zolfek nodded. This was the kind of operation the Corvani military practiced often. The solution was simple. Overwhelming force, acceptable losses, mission completion. Some civilians would die, but most would be saved. It was efficient. Tucker divided the group into teams. Amanda Brooks, a serious-looking cadet with dark hair, would lead one team. A quiet cadet named Maria Santos would lead another. Tucker would coordinate. From outside, "Remember," Tucker said, "everyone comes home." "No exceptions." Zolfek stared at him. "No exceptions. That is not realistic. Some losses are acceptable if the mission succeeds." The human cadets looked at him with surprise. Amanda spoke first. "Acceptable to who?" "Those aren't just numbers. On a screen, they're people. They have families, dreams, futures. But they are not soldiers," Zolfek said. "Their deaths, while unfortunate, are not as important as completing the mission." Maria Santos stepped forward. She was small, even by human standards, but her eyes were fierce. "That's not how we do things here. We don't abandon people. We don't write them off as acceptable losses. We find a way to save everyone." The simulation began. Zolfek watched as the human cadets moved through the building. They were careful, methodical, and patient. They used small teams to clear rooms slowly. They avoided areas where civilians might be hurt. They took risks to protect people. They had never met Dot. It was inefficient. It was dangerous. It was exactly the opposite of what Corvani soldiers would do, but it worked. The cadets rescued all 20 civilians without losing a single one. They captured the enemy soldiers instead of killing them. They completed the mission with 0 casualties. On either side, Zolfek could not believe what he had seen. "How?" he asked Tucker. "How did you do that?" Tucker smiled. We didn't give up. We found a way because we had to find a way. That's what humans do. That evening, Zalfek sat in his room and thought about the day. He had seen something impossible, a perfect mission with no losses. In Corvani military theory, such a thing could not exist. Every victory required sacrifice. Every success came at a cost, but the humans had proven his theory wrong. They had saved everyone because they refused to accept that anyone had to die. They had achieved the impossible because they believed the impossible was possible. He picked up one of the books from his desk and began to read. It was full of similar stories. Humans who had won battles they should have lost. Humans who had saved lives they should have written off. Humans who had succeeded where logic said they should have failed. Zalfek read until late into the night. His mind was full of new ideas, new possibilities. For the first time in his life, he began to question everything he had been taught about warfare. Maybe the humans were not weak. Maybe they were something else entirely. Maybe they were the strongest warriors in the galaxy, and everyone else was too blind to see it. As he finally closed the book and prepared for sleep, Zalfek felt something he had never experienced before. It was a strange feeling, uncomfortable, and exciting at the same time. It was doubt. Doubt about his own training, his own beliefs, his own understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. And for the first time since arriving on Earth, Zalfek found it hard to sleep. Captain Steve Rodriguez walked into the classroom with a slight limp. His left leg had been damaged in battle. Zalfek had learned, but he still served. In Corvani military culture, wounded soldiers were retired or given simple jobs. They were no longer useful for fighting. But humans seemed to value experience over perfect physical condition. Rodriguez was different from the other instructors. He was younger, with dark hair and intense eyes. Scars covered his hands and arms. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but strong. The cadets listened carefully to every word. "Today I want to tell you about the Titan mining colony, Rodriguez. Said, it was 3 years ago. My squad was sent to evacuate civilians during a pirate attack." He pulled up a map on the screen. It showed a small mining station on a distant moon. The station was surrounded by enemy ships. There was no way in or out except through the pirate blockade. The situation was simple, Rodriguez continued. 500 civilians trapped on the station. 50 pirates with military-grade weapons. My squad had 12 people. And math was not in our favor. Zalfek leaned forward. This was the kind of scenario he understood. The odds were impossible. Any reasonable commander would retreat and call for backup. It was the logical choice. "Command gave us 2 options," Rodriguez said. "We could wait for reinforcements, which would take 6 days, or we could try to rescue who we could and accept that most of the civilians would die." A cadet raised her hand. "What did you choose?" Rodriguez smiled, but it was not a happy expression. "We chose option 3. We decided to save everyone." The room was silent. Zalfek calculated the odds in his head. 12 soldiers against 50 pirates, with 500 civilians to protect. It was suicide. It was madness. It was the kind of decision that would get a Corvani officer court-martialed. "We started by studying the pirates," Rodriguez said. "They were professionals, but they were also greedy. They wanted the mining equipment more than they wanted to kill civilians. We used that against them." He showed videos of the mission. Zalfek watched as human soldiers moved through the mining station like ghosts. They used the station's own equipment as weapons. They turned mining lasers into artillery. They used the gravity generators to create traps. They made the pirates' superior numbers meaningless. "We fought for 3 days," Rodriguez said. "We used every trick we could think of. We turned the pirates against each other. We made them believe they were fighting a much larger force. We played on their fears and their greed. The video showed the final battle. Zolfek saw human soldiers doing impossible things. They fought with desperate creativity, using tools and weapons that were never meant for combat. They protected civilians while attacking enemies. They took wounds to keep others safe. In the end, we saved them all. Rodriguez said, 500 civilians evacuated safely. 50 pirates either captured or dead. Mission accomplished. A cadet named Danny Kim asked, "What were your casualties?" Rodriguez's expression changed. The smile disappeared. His eyes became distant and sad. "We lost 2 people. Sergeant Mike Chun and Corporal Amy Foster. They died holding the main entrance. So the civilians could escape. The room became even quieter. Zolfek could see the pain in Rodriguez's eyes. It was not the controlled sadness of a Corvani officer reporting losses. It was raw, personal grief. As if he had lost family members, not just soldiers under his command. "I still dream about them," Rodriguez said quietly. "I still wonder if I could have done something different. If I could have saved them too." After class, Zolfek approached Rodriguez. The human captain was packing his materials slowly, as if he was thinking about something far away. "Captain," Zolfek said, "I must ask you something. You saved 500 people, but you seem more concerned about the 2 you lost." "Why?" Rodriguez looked at him with surprise. "Why? Because they were my responsibility. They were my friends. They trusted me to bring them home, and I failed." "But you completed the mission," Zolfek said. "In Corvani military doctrine, losing only 2 soldiers out of 12 is an excellent result. You should be proud." Rodriguez stared at him for a long moment. "Proud? I lost 2 of my people. 2 good soldiers who will never see their families again. How could I be proud of that?" "Because you saved 500 civilians," Zolfek explained. "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. This is basic military logic." "Maybe," Rodriguez said. "But those few had names. Mike Chun had a daughter who was learning to walk. Amy Foster was going to get married when she got back. They weren't just numbers in a report. They were people." That evening, Zolfek could not stop thinking about Rodriguez's words. He sat in his room and tried to understand what he had seen. The human captain had achieved a perfect victory by any reasonable standard. He had saved 500 lives while losing only 2. It was the kind of success that would make a Corvani officer famous. But Rodriguez did not feel successful. He felt guilty. He carried the weight of those 2 deaths like a burden. He remembered their names, their families, their dreams. He made them matter in a way that Corvani officers never did. Zolfek thought about his own military career. He had commanded hundreds of soldiers over the years. Many had died under his command. He had written reports, filed paperwork, and moved on to the next mission. He had never learned their names or thought about their families. They were soldiers. Death was their job dot, but now, for the first time, he wondered about those soldiers. What were their names? What did they dream about? What did they leave behind? When they died, he picked up his communication device and accessed the Corvani military database. He searched for the records of soldiers who had died under his command. There were 43 names on the list. 43 people who had trusted him to lead them safely. He read their files one by one. Corval had been 19 years old when he died. He had been planning to become an engineer after his military service. Thakmer had left behind a mate and 3 children. Zelenara had written poetry in her spare time. They were not just soldiers. They were people. They had lives, dreams, and futures that ended because of decisions he had made, and he had never bothered to learn their names until now. Zolfek felt something strange happening in his chest. It was a tight, painful feeling that made it hard to breathe. He did not understand what it was at first. Then he realized it was guilt. It was the same expression he had seen on Rodriguez's face. He had spent his entire career thinking like a Corvani officer. Soldiers were tools to be used. Casualties were acceptable if the mission succeeded. Individual lives mattered less than the greater good. But the humans thought differently. They fought harder to save everyone because they believed everyone was worth saving. They achieved impossible victories because they refused to accept that anyone had to die. They carried the weight of every loss because they understood that. Every life had value. Z. A Thi closed the files and sat in the darkness. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be responsible for other people's lives. Not just their deaths, but their hopes, their dreams, their futures. Thought about the two soldiers Rodriguez had lost, Mike Chun and Amy Foster. They were strangers to Zolfek, but now he knew their names. He knew they had families who missed them. He knew they had died protecting others. He thought about the 43 soldiers who had died under his command. He would never forget their names again. He would carry their memory with him, just as Rodriguez carried the memory of his lost soldiers. Sleep did not come easily that night. Zolfek lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. His mind was full of faces and names. People who had trusted him, people who had died because of his decisions, people whose lives he had never bothered to value. The humans had taught him something terrible and beautiful. They had shown him that every life mattered. Every death was a loss. Every soldier was a person with hopes and dreams, and people who loved them. It was a heavy burden to carry. But as Zolfek finally drifted off to sleep, he knew he would never be the same kind of officer again. He could not go back to thinking of soldiers as tools. He could not ignore the weight of individual lives. The humans had changed him, and there was no going back. The war games began at dawn. Zolfek stood in the command center, looking at the maps and displays that showed the battle area. This was the Academy's most important training exercise. Every cadet would be tested. Every lesson would be put to use. Lieutenant Colonel Karen Walsh explained the rules. You have been assigned to defend the civilian population of New Haven City. The enemy force is 3 times your size. You have limited supplies, limited time, and limited support. Your job is to keep the civilians alive. Zolfek studied the tactical display. The city was built in a valley with only 2 roads leading in or out. The enemy would attack from the north with tanks and aircraft. His forces had basic weapons and some defensive positions. By any reasonable analysis, the city could not be defended. The simulation will run for 6 hours, Walsh continued. You will be judged on civilian casualties, military losses, and mission success. Remember, these are not just numbers. Every red dot on that screen represents a person. Zolfek was given command of a mixed unit. Half were human cadets from West Point. The other half were advanced combat robots programmed to fight like enemy soldiers. The humans would follow his orders, but they would also think for themselves. They would question decisions that seemed wrong. His second in command was Ryan Tucker, the confident cadet who had led the hostage rescue simulation. Amanda Brooks would control the southern defenses. Maria Santos would handle civilian evacuation. Danny Kim would manage supplies and communications. What's the plan, sir? Tucker asked. Zolfek looked at the map. Traditional Corvani doctrine was clear. When facing superior forces, you conducted a fighting withdrawal. You made the enemy pay for every advance, but you preserved your forces for a counterattack. Some civilians would die, but most could be evacuated. We will establish 3 defensive lines, he said. The first will slow the enemy advance. The second will hold them while we evacuate the most important civilians. The third will be our final position before withdrawal. Tucker frowned. What? About the civilians in the northern districts? They can't be evacuated in time. They are acceptable losses, Zalfek said. We cannot save everyone. The human cadets looked at each other. Amanda spoke first. Sir, with respect, we don't abandon people. There has to be another way. There is no other way, Zalfek said firmly. The mathematics are clear. We cannot defend the entire city with these forces. Then we change the mathematics, Maria said. We make the enemy fight on our terms. Zalfek stared at her. How? Like the Spartans at Thermopylae, she said. Like the British at Rorke's Drift. We use the terrain. We use creativity. We find a way to win. The simulation began. Enemy forces poured into the valley from the north. Zalfek implemented his defensive plan. The first line held for 30 minutes before falling back. The second line held for an hour. Civilians were evacuated from the southern districts, but the northern districts were still full of people. Thousands of red dots on the tactical display, representing men, women, and children who would die when the enemy reached them. Sir, Tucker said, I have an idea. What if we don't fight a withdrawal? What if we fight like humans? What does that mean? Zalfek asked. It means we hold the line, Amanda said. All of it. We don't give up any ground. We don't abandon anyone. That is impossible, Zalfek said. We will be destroyed. Maybe, Danny said, but maybe not. The enemy expects us to retreat. They're spreading out to cover more ground. What if we concentrated all our forces in one place? Zalfek looked at the tactical display. The enemy was indeed spreading out. They were preparing for a long battle of attrition. They expected the humans to fight like reasonable soldiers. If we put everyone in one defensive position, Maria said, we could hold them. The valley narrows about 2 miles north of the city. They'd have to come through that choke point. And if we lose? Zalfek asked. Then we lose trying to save everyone, Tucker said. That's better than winning by sacrificing people. Zalfek felt something strange happening in his mind. The logical part of him said this was madness. A tactical part of him said it would never work. But another part of him, a part that had been growing since he arrived on Earth, said it might be possible. He thought about the battles he had studied. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off an empire. Rorke's Drift, where 100 British soldiers defeated 4,000 warriors. The Titan mining colony, where 12 humans saved 500 civilians. All of them had been impossible. All of them had succeeded. Do it, he said. The cadets moved quickly. They pulled back all their forces to the narrow pass north of the city. They used the terrain to their advantage, setting up overlapping fields of fire. They turned the enemy's superior numbers into a disadvantage. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh watched from the command center. She had seen this simulation run hundreds of times. No cadet unit had ever successfully defended the city. The mathematics were too clear. The enemy force was too large. But something was different this time. The alien commander was not fighting like a traditional military officer. He was fighting like a human. The battle raged for 3 hours. Wave after wave of enemy forces crashed against the defensive position. The humans held the line. They used every trick they had learned, every lesson they had been taught. They fought with desperate creativity and stubborn determination. Zalfek watched his forces take casualties. Each loss hit him like a physical blow. These were not just tactical units on a display. They were people. They had names, families, dreams. Some were his students. Some had become his friends. Sir, Tucker sighed, we're running low on ammunition. Hold the line, Zalfek said. Sir, Amanda reported, the enemy is trying to flank us from the east. Redirect Team 3 to block them, Zalfek ordered. Sir, Maria called out, Civilian evacuation is only 60% complete. Keep them moving, Zalthek said. We. Hold until everyone is safe. The enemy commander grew frustrated. His forces should have broken through by now. He had superior numbers, better weapons, and air support. But the defenders would not break. They would not retreat. They fought like they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. With 1 hour left in the simulation, something unexpected happened. The enemy made a mistake. They concentrated too many forces in one area, leaving their flank exposed. Danny Kim spotted the opening. "Sir," he said, "if we hit them now, we can break their attack." Zalfek saw the opportunity. A small force could strike at the enemy's weak point and scatter their formation. It was exactly the kind of tactical brilliance that Corvani officers were trained to recognize. But it would mean leaving the defensive position. It would mean risking the lives of his soldiers on a desperate gamble. "Do it," he said. The counterattack was swift and brutal. Human cadets and combat robots struck at the enemy's flank, rolling up their line like a carpet. The enemy formation collapsed. Their commander, faced with unexpected defeat, ordered a retreat. The simulation ended. A tactical display showed the results. 0 civilian casualties. Minimal military losses. Total victory. The command center was silent. Lieutenant Colonel Walsh stared at the display in disbelief. In 20 years of running this simulation, no one had ever achieved a perfect result. "How?" she asked. Zolfek looked at his human cadets. They were tired, dirty, and wounded from the simulation. But they were smiling. They had done something impossible, and they knew it. "We fought like humans," he said. That night, Zalthik sat in his room and thought about what had happened. He had abandoned everything he had been taught about warfare. He had ignored logic, mathematics, and common sense. He had chosen to fight for everyone, instead of accepting that some people had to die, and it had worked. He understood now why the humans were so dangerous. They did not fight like reasonable soldiers. They fought like people who believed that every life mattered. They achieved impossible victories because they refused to accept that anything was truly impossible. The transformation was complete. Zalfek was no longer a Corvani officer. He was something new, something different. He was a soldier who had learned to fight with a human heart, but with that transformation came a price. Sleep would not come easily anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the people he had saved and the people he had lost. He felt the weight of every decision, every life, every moment where he had chosen to fight instead of retreat. It was a heavy burden. But it was also a gift. He had learned what it meant to be truly strong. Not strong enough to accept casualties, but strong enough to refuse them. Not strong enough to win at any cost, but strong enough to win while saving everyone. The humans had given him something precious. They had shown him how to be a better soldier by teaching him to value every life he was sworn to protect. Now he would carry that lesson home, and he would never sleep peacefully again. The final night came too soon. Zalfek packed his few belongings slowly, not wanting to leave. The small room that had seemed so strange months ago now felt like home. The books on his desk were worn from reading. The bed was familiar and comfortable. The window looked out on green spaces that no longer seemed alien. He could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces. Human faces, alien faces, the faces of soldiers who had died under his command. He saw the tactical displays from the war games, the red dots that represented people who might have died if he had made different choices. At midnight, he gave up trying to sleep. He walked out of the dormitory and on to the academy grounds. The night air was cool and fresh. Stars filled the sky above, some of them marking the locations of worlds he had visited in his military career. The academy was quiet at this hour. Most cadets were asleep, preparing for another day of training. But Zalfek wandered the paths he had walked many times during his stay. He passed the library, where he had read about human military history. He walked by the training grounds, where he had learned new ways of thinking about warfare. Finally, he found himself at the memorial wall. It was a simple stone structure, with names carved into black granite. These were graduates of the academy, who had died in service to their species. Hundreds of names stretched across the wall. Each one representing a life-cut short dot at the bottom of the wall was an inscription. They gave their lives so others might live. Zalfek read the words again and again. Months ago, they would have seemed wasteful to him. Why give your life for others? Why not preserve yourself to fight another day? It had made no sense from a military perspective. Now he understood. These humans had not died because they were careless or stupid. They had died because they chose to value other lives more than their own. They had made the ultimate sacrifice, not for glory or empire, but to protect people they had never met. Can't sleep? Zalfek turned to see Commander Morrison approaching. The human looked tired but alert. He carried 2 cups of coffee, offering one to the alien officer. "Thank you," Zalfek said, accepting the warm cup. "I find sleep difficult these days." Morrison stood beside him, looking at the memorial wall. "It's hard to sleep when you understand what it really means to be responsible for other people's lives. How do you bear it?" Zalfek asked. "How do you carry the weight of every decision, every life, every moment where someone might die because of what you choose?" Morrison sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "You learn to live with it. You accept that the weight is part of the job, and you remember that carrying that weight makes you a better officer. In Corvani military culture, we are taught to be strong," Zalfek said. "Strength means accepting casualties. Strength means making hard choices without emotion. Strength means preserving resources for future battles." "Maybe," Morrison said, "but I think real strength is different. Real strength is refusing to accept that anyone has to die. Real strength is making the impossible choice to save everyone. Real strength is carrying the burden of every life and never getting used to it." They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars. Zalfek thought about the journey that had brought him here. He had come to Earth as a Corvani officer, confident in his training and his understanding of warfare. He was returning as something else entirely. "What will you do when you go home?" Morrison asked. "I will try to teach what I have learned." Zalfek said, "I will try to show my people that there is a better way to fight. A way that values every life instead of treating soldiers as tools. It won't be easy," Morrison warned. "People don't like to change the way they think about things. Especially military people." "No," Zalfek agreed. "But I have seen what humans can accomplish when they fight with their hearts as well as their minds. I have seen impossible victories achieved through sheer determination to save everyone. I cannot go back to the old ways," Morrison nodded. "Sleep will come eventually, when you've earned it by making the choices that save lives instead of spending them." The next morning, Zalfek stood on the landing pad where his transport ship waited. The human cadets he had worked with came to see him off. Ryan Tucker, Amanda Brooks, Maria Santos, Danny Kim, and others he had come to think of as friends. "Remember what you taught us," Amanda said. "Sometimes the impossible choice is the right choice." "Remember what you taught me," Zalfek replied, "that every life has value, and no one is acceptable loss." The goodbyes were difficult. These humans had changed him in ways he was still discovering. They had shown him a different way to be a soldier, a different way to think about warfare, a different way to value life. The journey home took 3 weeks. Zalfek spent the time writing reports for his superiors. He described human military. capabilities in detail. He explained their tactics, their training methods, their equipment. But most importantly, he tried to explain their philosophy. He wrote about soldiers who fought not for conquest, but for protection. He described officers who valued the lives of their troops more than victory itself. He explained how humans achieved impossible victories by refusing to accept that anyone had to die. When he arrived at Corvani military headquarters, his reports were met with skepticism. His superiors read his accounts with growing disbelief. They dismissed his descriptions as the fantasies of an officer who had been compromised by alien influence. "These humans have clearly affected your judgment," his commanding officer said. "You describe military tactics that are inefficient and emotional. You recommend changes to our doctrine that would make us weak." But Zolfek was no longer the same officer who had left months ago. He had seen the face of true military strength. He had learned what it meant to fight with purpose beyond personal glory or empire expansion. "With respect, sir," he said, "I believe our doctrine is already weak. We train soldiers to accept casualties instead of preventing them. We measure success by objectives achieved rather than lives saved. We have confused efficiency with effectiveness." His superiors were not convinced. They reassigned him to a training position, thinking it would be harmless. They did not realize that this was exactly what Zalfek wanted. He began training young Corvani officers in new ways of thinking about warfare. He taught them about the importance of individual lives. He showed them examples of human military tactics that achieved victory through creativity and determination rather than overwhelming force. Many of his students were skeptical at first. They had been raised in Corvani military culture, where strength meant accepting losses and weakness meant caring too much about individual soldiers. But slowly, some began to understand. Lieutenant Cathvar was the first to truly embrace the new philosophy. She was young and eager to learn. When Zalfek taught her about the Battle of Thermopylae, she saw not a pointless sacrifice, but a strategic masterpiece that inspired an entire civilization. Sergeant Mortek took longer to convince. He was an old soldier, set in his ways. But when Zalfek showed him the tactical analysis of the Titan mining colony rescue, he began to see how human methods could be more effective than traditional Corvani approaches. Slowly, word spread through the Corvani military. There was an instructor who taught strange new ideas about warfare, ideas that came from studying human military philosophy. Some officers were curious, others were skeptical. A few were hostile, but Zalfek continued teaching. He knew that change would be slow and difficult. He knew that many would resist his ideas, but he also knew that he had seen the future of warfare, and it looked like humanity. Months passed. Zalfek's sleep remained troubled. Every night, he dreamed of the faces he had seen at the academy. Human cadets who laughed and joked, but fought with the fury of true warriors. Officers who carried the weight of every life under their command. Soldiers who achieved impossible victories because they refused to accept that anyone had to die. He thought about Amanda Brooks, who had challenged his understanding of acceptable losses. He remembered Ryan Tucker, who had taught him that humans find ways to win because they have to find ways to win. He recalled Maria Santos, who had shown him that true strength comes from protecting others, not conquering them. The sleepless nights were difficult, but they were also a reminder. Every time he lay awake thinking about the weight of command, he remembered why it mattered. Every time he struggled with a difficult decision, he thought about what his human friends would do. One day, news came that would test everything he had learned. A Corvani colony was under attack by pirates. The situation was desperate. The colonial militia was outnumbered and outgunned. High Command was preparing to write off the colony as a necessary loss. Zalfek requested permission to lead a rescue mission. his superiors were reluctant. He was known for his strange ideas about human military philosophy. But the situation was desperate, and they had few other options. He was given a small force and told not to expect reinforcements. The mission parameters were clear. Evacuate who you can, accept that most will die, preserve military resources. For future operations. It was standard Corvani doctrine, but Zalfek had no intention of following standard doctrine. He had learned a different way of fighting, a way that valued every life and refused to accept that anyone was expendable. Rescue mission was everything his human teachers had prepared him for. I